The state of Florida has a major problem. In fact, it has thousands of them. Sinkholes. Unpredictable, cavernous openings capable of engulfing everything above. They've been the cause of evacuation at Disneyland, residential areas, and places of business alike. Perhaps one of the worst occurrences was a 350-foot wide by 75-foot deep sinkhole in Winter Park back in May of 1981. Dragging a decades-old sycamore tree into the abyss before widening into the largest sinkhole ever witnessed by man as a result of natural geological reasons or conditions. So why does this keep happening? And if it's such a common issue in Florida, why haven't you heard about it? Stay tuned to find out, as today we discover the history of Florida's sinkhole problem. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Sinkholes are everywhere in Florida, and the problem is much older than the state itself. It's also important to point out that sinkholes are not unique to just that region, and they occur for many various reasons. In fact, as you'll see later in this video, I headed to Poland of all places to show you guys what sinkholes from an industrial mining town look like. I actually found one that engulfed an entire cemetery. And if you're wondering how I dealt with the language barrier in the process, well, everything was made much easier thanks to our sponsor Babbel, one of the best language apps in the world. Babbel is proven to help you start speaking a new language in 3 weeks, and the lessons are designed by real teachers, and it's very interactive as subscribers get 2 free live classes. Babbel teaches real-world conversation to prepare you for conversations in foreign languages, for business, travel, relationships, and more. You can choose from a few different subscriptions, one of which is good for a lifetime. For example, my logistics were made much easier thanks to their fun and easy-to-use lessons. For example, this lesson about buying train tickets to get back to the city center really helped me navigate, and it was so easy to retain the information. All you have to do is follow the lesson, repeat after the teacher, and you will retain the language very fast. Let me show you how this works.
Poproszę bilet do centrum.
Poproszę bilet do centrum. Oh, and I got it.
Proszę skasować bilet.
So now I'm going to learn how to say, please validate my ticket. Proszę skasować bilet. This is amazing.
Bilet normalny czy ulgowy?
Okay, standard or reduced ticket? Bilet normalny czy ulgowy? And it's really helpful because not only do you get to hear the audio from a native, but when you read it back, you're actually reading at the same time. So you're retaining how the word looks, which is helpful when you see it in everyday life. It's like having a teacher in your pocket. I've been using Babbel for years, and I just couldn't recommend it highly enough. In fact, the logistics of this video, as you'll see later, really would not have been possible without it. So start speaking a new language in 3 weeks with Babbel and get up to 60% off your subscription by clicking my link in the description. Thank you, Babbel, for sponsoring the channel. And now, back to Florida's sinkhole problem. When it comes to the oldest recorded sinkhole in the state, many would point to Kingsley Lake, Florida's oldest and highest altitude body of water. According to some sources, it was created by a sinkhole and is also a perfect circle. There is also evidence to suggest that Native Americans in Florida may have utilized sinkholes for various purposes, such as a source of water, a place of ceremony and ritual, food resources, or even a habitat. That's right, some archaeological evidence suggests that Native American communities may have established settlements near sinkholes. The surrounding landscape and natural resources provided by sinkholes could have been advantageous for habitation. With that in mind, it does not take much to find sinkholes older than most people realize. Several landmarks within Florida were created by sinkholes. Even looking off the shores, you'll find so-called blue holes, sinkholes that occur underwater. These sinkholes have been appearing since long before Florida was a part of the United States. But what causes them? To get to the bottom of the cause of these sinkholes, we're going to have to define what precisely a sinkhole is in a geological sense. A sinkhole is an area of ground with no natural external surface drainage. So when it rains, the water stays inside the sinkhole and drains into the subsurface. They can vary from just a few feet to hundreds of acres wide, as well as from less than a foot to over 100 feet deep. Typically, a sinkhole forms so slowly that you can barely notice it, but that's not the case when a collapse occurs. A collapse requires several factors. You see, sinkholes are common where the rock below the surface is limestone, carbonate rock, salt beds, or other rocks that can be naturally dissolved by groundwater circulating through them. As the rock dissolves, it creates pockets underground, and if there's not enough support for the land above these spaces, the land above it collapses into the space below. The size of the space beneath the surface is the factor that determines the size of the sinkhole. So, what is it about Florida that makes it such a magnet for sinkholes anyways? Well, the Florida Peninsula is just the exposed part of a much larger landmass, one that was above water approximately 20,000 years ago. This landmass is mainly composed of submerged carbonate rock, capped with a sequence of relatively insoluble sand and clay deposits. As mentioned earlier, carbonate rock is one of the many kinds of rock responsible for the appearance of sinkholes. The soluble, that is, dissolvable limestone and dolomites that make up the carbonate rocks, are weathered into something known as karst, a terrain defined by flat land on the surface and many cavities under the surface. As these underground chambers coalesce and interconnect, the groundwater connecting them moves much more, speeding up the process of erosion and making more gaps. However, the highest frequency of sinkholes is not statewide. The majority of sinkholes are localized in the central western regions of the Florida Peninsula and a little up into the Panhandle. This area is generally referred to as Sinkhole Alley, a group of counties in central Florida with the highest risk of sinkholes appearing. This kind of terminology may invoke thoughts of Tornado Alley, the area encompassing several central U.S. states that are most susceptible to tornadoes during tornado season. And it turns out that that's not the end of this comparison. There is such a thing as, quote, sinkhole season. Around early spring, when rain is expected, sinkholes tend to appear more often. The riskiest situation regarding sinkhole outbreaks is a heavy rainstorm directly after a drought, though droughts alone generally increase sinkhole likeliness significantly. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the biggest sinkhole due to natural geology ever witnessed by man was in Winter Park, and its story is astonishing. The sinkhole started slowly. The first to hear of it was the dog of resident Maya Rose Owens, who was barking at the widening gap in her yard. Within a few hours, a decades-old sycamore tree had been swallowed to its roots. Owens eventually described it as disappearing with a ploop sound deep into the ground. The following day, her family evacuated, just in time to escape the hole widening wider and devouring their 3-bedroom house. As it grew, it took parts of 2 separate streets, a car dealership with 5 Porsches, and the town's Olympic swimming pool, with the city workers ultimately only being able to salvage banks of toilets and sinks from the bathrooms. This 350-foot wide abyss brought on quite a bit of attention. After it opened, it became a tourist attraction of sorts, with food concession stands opening, as well as others selling balloons and commemorative Sinkhole 81 t-shirts. Thousands of people watched it open, and it received worldwide news coverage in the aftermath. Speaking of the aftermath, cranes removed 3 of the 5 Porsche cars and a camper van whose owner drove it away from the scene before attempting to fill it with dirt and concrete. However, with it stabilized, the sinkhole naturally grew into a pond, where somewhat eerily, the Owens house remained at the bottom as water began to fill in. And in honor of Miss Rose's passing in 2005, it was ultimately renamed Lake Rose, a name which it still goes by. In 2001, a drought around Orlando created the perfect conditions for sinkholes. Such was the case when a pair of sinkholes began threatening an office building in Maitland. The first sinkhole appeared without much concern, but as it worsened, it caused over 20 feet of the building's wall to lower several inches. And after that, the evacuation order came out. Shortly later, a second hole opened, knocking over a tree and damaging a nearby sidewalk, but leaving the building unscathed. 400 employees evacuated, carrying business records and computers, rushing in and out, back and forth before the city's officially imposed evacuation deadline, 4:30 p.m. As this was a rather gradual opening, the building's tenants did not notice something wrong until some employees on the second floor could not close their doors. As the week wore on, cracks began appearing in the walls and sidewalks, and eventually a ground-level concrete wall panel on the southwest side began to droop. By Monday the next week, a steel double door near the sinkhole's entrance had twisted so much that the doors themselves began to overlap with each other. After that event, engineers concluded that the damage was minimal and could be repaired easily, which often happens with sinkholes. Surprisingly, repairs for sinkholes are often relatively quick and painless, providing they are more shallow, which is most often the case. Another place where sinkholes commonly appear is in the world's largest retirement community, known as the Village. It's one of America's safest communities regarding crime, partly due to its median age being 66, the oldest of any U.S. county. However, it lies right in the middle of Sinkhole Alley, and when they strike, they tend to arrive in groups. One incident in mid-February of 2018 saw 7 sinkholes opening in and around a golf course, causing 4 homes to evacuate. Mercifully, sinkhole deaths are quite rare. Florida only had 6 up to that point in 2018, but the ones that occurred were chilling, especially when it comes to the story of victim Jeffrey Bush, who was asleep when a sinkhole opened up and buried him 20 feet underground, never to be recovered. The family was aware of the issue as sinkholes had opened on their property twice before, but tragically, the third time was the charm, as recalled by his brother. Quote, "I opened the door, and there was a big hole there. His bed and dresser and everything was gone. He was gone. I jumped in the hole immediately and started digging because I heard him yelling for me. Jeremy, please help me." Considering the gravity of the situation, local officials acted fast. The Bush's home was condemned and demolished along with 2 neighboring homes, and loved ones placed a memorial at the edge of the fenced-off property, hoping closure would come in time. But 2 years later, in 2015, it collapsed again, sinking the poor victim's remains even further into the earth. Jeremy Bush, his sibling, is haunted not only by the loss of his brother, but by the idea of the gravesite being continually churned. He recalls, quote, "I live this nightmare every day. Every day. I have a hard time sleeping. It's just rough. Just let me be." His final resting place was that sinkhole. It just keeps opening up, and they keep adding more dirt on top of them. It's sad to me. When you look at satellite images of the site today, it's extremely eerie, as the gravel-filled hole still sits in the middle of what is an otherwise very ordinary community. This story is so heart-wrenching. If you look at the family's home in 2012, it's completely normal. They've got some sheds in the back, nice vegetation. Fast forward to 2013, the year of the tragedy. You can see they've got 2 cars in the driveway. People are home. Life is going on as usual. But then if you move to 2013, the same year, just in March, the house is gone. You can see the sinkhole filled in with gravel, a barrier around it, and what I presume to be another barrier, perhaps the home's original fence. As the years pass, the homes adjacent are now demolished as well. And you really have to wonder, how do the neighbors across the street feel, or the neighbors just next to the vacant lot, knowing that a man was literally eaten by the earth, and now every time you look out your window, you see this gravel-filled hole with a bizarre kind of fence around it. So this is a touching story indeed. Unfortunately, it seems this will continue to happen. The state of Florida doesn't fund much sinkhole research, with critics suggesting that the topic is bad news for prime real estate, one of the state's leading economic forces. But I'll let you speculate on that in the comment section below. The sinkholes of Florida are older than the concept of Florida itself, but they're rapidly becoming more of an issue that has affected everyday people in the worst way possible, and all indications suggest that sinkholes will remain a part of life there for the foreseeable future. But like I said at the top of the video, this issue is not unique, and it can also be caused by man-made industries such as mining. That was the case here in Europe, on the other side of the world, where a massive sinkhole opened up and swallowed the better part of a cemetery. I also wanted to present you guys an example of just how global this issue can be. In front of me is a cemetery in the heart of Europe where a massive sinkhole has taken out a great portion of the graves. And this issue is complicated because, of course, family members want to visit, pay their respects. The story here is not so unusual. A coal mine, which has been abandoned since the 1960s, has began to collapse. Unfortunately, a lot of the terrain has changed in that time. There are residential buildings on top of chambers. And so in addition to the cemetery, life here has become somewhat unstable, which I suppose is to be expected when sinkholes might open up. Now, this really makes an impression. Look at that. This entire building has been condemned as well. You can see it's been posted here that the terrain is dangerous. The land's been condemned, so you're not supposed to explore in there. You can see people had kind of summer gardens here, but unfortunately it's all taped off, completely condemned. And here it seems that you have land that might be susceptible to a sinkhole. It says it's unsafe and entrance is forbidden. In fact, it's not even encouraged to walk where I am right now, which is why we'll get back to the studio. Not unlike Florida, sinkholes have opened here under buildings, roads, and businesses, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So perhaps sinkholes are just an inconvenient reality of life. Let's just hope that no one we love ever ends up in one. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.